All right, the next sort of unit that we're going to look at is civil liberties and civil rights, which definitely are sort of like right along the lines of relating to the judicial branch. That the courts often deal with protecting civil liberties and civil rights. It's just important that you know what the difference is between them. All right. So civil liberties are protections of citizens like fundamental freedoms. So these would be sort of protections against an abusive government, maintaining your freedom of speech and freedom of press, rights of marriage. Like most of the things that we find in the Bill of Rights, right, are civil liberties for the most part, right? Um, and civil rights are sort of attempts by the government to promote equality, being the key word, amongst all its citizens. So civil liberties are like protections from the government, and civil rights are sort of like the government trying to promote equality amongst all of its citizens. And again, these are terms that you've definitely heard of before. So, like, where do we get our civil liberties from? Well, as I mentioned, the Bill of Rights is one of the fundamental sort of sources of our civil liberties. You're familiar with most of these amendments, but most of these amendments were put into place after a reaction to like our experiences with the British government trying to take these things away from us. And these are protections against a potentially abusive government. And then there are some others too. These are like terms we talked about. These are things that like didn't exist under the Articles of Confederation system that were written into the Constitution. So like in Article 1, Section 9, these are things that like the government can't do. They can't pass bills of attainder or ex post facto laws. Hopefully you remember what these things are. A bill of attainder is a law passed by Congress that declares a group guilty without a trial. Ex post facto law is sort of like retroactively punishing people. Like they were doing something that is now illegal, but you're punishing them for doing this at a time when it was deemed to be legal. Right? These things are also things you can't do. And then habeas corpus is mentioned also in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. You can't take away habeas corpus unless in cases of rebellion or invasion or if the public safety may require it. So habeas corpus is simply a written court order that requires government officials to present a prisoner in court and to explain to a judge why a prisoner is being held. This basically prevents the government from unlawfully detaining people. You at least have to explain to a judge, like, sort of the preliminary basis of like why you're holding someone. And if a judge believes that that's like frivolous and isn't like reasonable, then the judge could free the person at that point. And again, the basic premise is that you can't be held against your will without some sort of just cause that is provided by the government to like a judge. So these are the primary sources of your civil liberties. Your civil rights, the sources of your civil rights tend to come from amendments as well. There are a bunch of amendments related to equality, whether they're civil rights related to like the Civil War era, like the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, or the 15th Amendment, which gives African Americans the right to vote, or the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. There are lots of examples of amendments that try to promote like equality amongst its citizens, or like court cases, whether it's like Brown versus the Board of Education, or like other sort of like court cases that have reaffirmed the rights that people have and have tried to establish equality. Tons of examples of those, or like basic pieces of legislation, laws passed by Congress, like civil rights acts that were instrumental in, again, knocking down other barriers that were often posed, or a law like Title IX, which some of you may have done a little bit more research on in 10th grade, which tried to promote equality for extracurricular offerings for women in schools that receive like public funding. So there are lots of examples of like sources that like your civil rights emanate from as